So we only have this week and next week, and then we'll be done with this section, because the week following that is the first week of Advent, if you can believe that. So,
It's coming.
27th of November is Advent 1. So I don't know what we're going to do in the year, in the new year, but we only have this week and next week. So since we missed last week, so we'll have one one lesson that we'll skip, but that's all right. Today we want to focus on this idea of Jesus as the embodiment of God in the world as it is. And we talked a little bit the last time we were together about the idea that Jesus is the foundation for what we're coming to believe and understand as religionless Christianity, because Jesus then gives us the means to live in the presence of God and in the life of God, apart from all the workings that go along with it. And as I was reading this past week in preparation, remember that passage out of Matthew, and you'll recognize it, where Jesus says, "All you who are weary and burdened, come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened." And when you think about that, what images run through your mind as you listen to Jesus say those things? Where do you normally put weary and burdened in? Or what's he speaking about?
Cares of life?
Okay, that's how we usually think of that. But when you go back into the context of what he was saying and the kinds of things that he was doing at that point in Matthew, you begin to see that it makes more sense for him to be saying, all of you who are weary and burdened with the trappings of religious life, the way that it's been delivered to you in this time. Well, what was weary and burdensome to them? The laws, and all the junk around the laws that were built up. I mean, even remember the council in Jerusalem. After the whole thing is done, Pentecost has come, the gospel is spreading, the kingdom is going, the Gentiles are coming in. They have that council at Jerusalem. What do you do with these pesky Gentiles who are coming into the church? How can we abide that? And how can we hang together? And some of them said, well, they need to obey the law of Moses, and then then they're in, kind of a thing. But then they said, I think it was Peter even who said, why would we lay on them the kinds of things neither we or our forefathers have been able to bear? Why would we do that? Because of all the extra stuff that was laid onto the law. And so Jesus was just speaking in Matthew 11 to people who are just tired of all of that, and that's why he says, "Come unto me, for my burden is light. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." In other words, there's not going to be this kind of hoopla associated with living this life. And so I think that's the kernel of what we're after in this search, and what I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer was looking for is that sense of how do you live the kind of life that God intends for us to live apart from all the trappings that have been built up around it. And came across another interesting idea this past week. I'm not trying to hide behind the thing here. Just look.
Right on the back.
It's just a new kind of Wheel of Fortune. What letter am I writing? So we're going to define religion one way, and I'll just say life in Christ as opposed to that. And this is kind of what I'm going to recommend as the religionless Christianity approach here. But there was an interesting little distinction it came across in reading that this week that that said, and they didn't use it this way, but this immediately sprang to my mind as we thought about it. One way of being in the world is in the world for God. And that's one approach to things. Is we're going to be in the world for God. We'll be the people in the world that are known to be for God, and that's kind of a religious approach, because then we take on these practices, we take on these whatever it is, all the attractions of the religious thing. But the other way is to be in God for the world. And that's a different approach. And that is, I think, the kind of thing that marks the distinction of what we've been exploring in our time together. That the religious approach is to try and demonstrate one's commitment to God by what one does and so forth. But the life that Christ is recommending is to be drawn into the life of God and the purpose of God and the character of God, not for its sake itself, but for the world, so that what God is doing in the world can be accomplished through the people who clearly live in God. And this is what we come to find out with Jesus. He is the embodiment of God in the world as it is. And what we've come to understand as we read through the Gospels is that this is intentional on Jesus' part. In John 14, a really profound statement, a lot of them in John 14, 15, and 16. Of course, you can spend a lot of time in those chapters. They're just filled with great stuff. But in John 14, at the beginning of this huge important section in John, is that whole exchange where Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and life," and blah blah blah, and then Philip makes that request after that. He says, "Well, just show us the Father," right? Do you remember that moment? And Jesus makes this very profound statement in answer to Philip's request. When Philip says, "Just show us the Father," the word he uses for "show" in the original language is a word that's called "make known." Not like ta-da, here it is all along. It's make known, help us know, make known, show us the Father. In other words, he's asking, what is the Father like? What is the Father like? And the reply, Jesus says, if you've seen me, then you've seen the Father. In other words, this is what the Father's like. I am what the Father is like. So everything that is true about Jesus is true about God. And so that becomes a very profound grasp of Jesus' role in the world, is to be in God for the world. Jesus wasn't trying to prove his righteousness. He was trying to reveal God in a way that people could understand. So he's saying to Philip, if you see me, you know what the Father's like. And so we've seen the Father embodied in the world. We've seen what God is like in the world through Jesus. So the question is, to what kind of world did the Father come? To what kind of world did he come? Well, he came to this one, the one with all of its imperfections, challenges, conflicts, and suffering. And they discovered and met and were drawn to and drawn in by the God who came to the world in which they truly lived. There wasn't this sense of we had to create this separate, sanitary, pure, untouched bubble space in the world, which is the only place we could find God. God came to the world that was the same one we inhabit. And in a sense, we only meet God in the world here. That's where we're intended to meet God. And so Jesus helps us in this idea to realize that God came through Jesus to this world, the same world that we live in, but it was the real God who came. It wasn't an image, or it wasn't a projection of our sense of what God was like. It was the real God. So Jesus is the embodiment of the real God in the world as it truly is. So we don't have to wait for the world to get cleaned up in order to see God at work in the world. We don't have to wait for the world to conform to our understanding of what we think it should be. We have to recognize that God, there wasn't any pre-qualifying condition for God to come to this world. Just the fact that God loved the world and wanted to be part of the world. And interestingly enough, being a human in the world was the only experience that God had to that point not yet known. That was the only thing of God that was outside of God's personal experience. And so sometimes when we talk about God coming to earth in Jesus, the term that we often use for that is, do you know what it is?
Incarnation?
Well, incarnation, yes. There's another one. I mean, that's true. That is exactly right. That's you would get an A on the test for that answer.
I'm still up on the top line there instead of down here. So.
No, incarnation is correct, but there's another more the idea of it, not the fact.
Talk about his humbleness and the way.
Yeah, you're getting there.
Okay.
It's often called the condescension.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard that term before, the condescension? Yeah. Okay. So that is a very obscure and not widely used anymore.
But for God beyond our understanding to become human in presence is a whole different. It's a whole trans.
Good. Well, this is why they call it
the authority and all the other, but then we try to understand that.
But this is why they call it the condescension, because God had to give up all this stuff in order to come and be a human, right? And so we talk about, and that then leads into this idea of how worthless and how weak and vulnerable and blah 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 humanity is, and so a lot of I think wrong-headed theology ends up emerging from that understanding, because even though Paul makes a statement in Philippians 2, and this is where it comes from, Paul makes a statement in Philippians 2 about, though Jesus was equal with God, he humbled himself, he emptied himself, and so forth. And so that's where that whole idea comes from. But if you step back for a moment and think about it, what it is really the expansion of God into the fullness of all that God had created in creation. Because now, for the first time, through Jesus, God experiences the only thing that he hadn't, previously known. What does it mean to be human? And so now we see as I think the expansion or the elevation of God, or the growth of God in that sense, and so God didn't have to have any special place for that to happen. It had to happen in the place that God designed for us to live and to meet Him, which is here in this place. And so the fact that it is possible for us to meet God in this place also means it is possible for us to express God in this place. So God has given us those abilities. So just as Jesus is the embodiment of God in the world as it is, because how many times have you perhaps had this thought or heard this thought where people said, well, if only it were like this, or if only this had happened, then I would be able to do this, or whatever. I had an interesting conversation with somebody in my family long time ago, a cousin or something, who once made a statement to me that said it was easier for him to be a Christian in a crowd, because then he had the support of everybody around him and so forth, and he was able to continue to do that. He says it was much harder for him to to do that on his own and be by himself in the world like that. And I thought, sometimes we have this idea that there is this certain picture of what it means to live in God that we have to live up to or live into, when in fact what God really wants is the unique person that God created each of us to be, to emerge in the world, and that we can do that like on our own or in a crowd or whether it doesn't depend. God is not asking you to be like anybody else or to have this preconceived idea of what it means to live in that life. Is simply to live solely and completely and without reservation or qualification in the unadulterated life of God, mitigated by the Spirit of God, and to then live into the fullness of that life, and to do so for the sake of what God loves, the world. And to do so without any need to conform to anybody else's idea of what it means to do that. Only to be faithful to what God is calling you to do and to be. So it's not a matter of what you do; it's a matter of who you are, and who you are will dictate what you do, and it will be very non-self-conscious, if that's a word. That's my German background. I'm trying to create another big word out of using several small words together.
Is that idea of not letting your right hand know what your left hand is doing?
I think in a sense that's it. Yeah, not letting your right hand. It's the non-self-conscious piece of that. We go back to the Matthew 25 passage. When did we see you all in all these ways? They don't know that because they've not been keeping track. And we live in a world that keeps score. People keep score.
We keep score
to ourselves too.
We're bad about ourselves.
Yeah. We do that to ourselves, and it's a non-starter. It's really not helpful at all, because it prevents us from the release. We get back into the weary and burdensome part of what it means to follow God instead of the liberation, the light and easy thing. And the other thing is we have no idea what that really is to be. So we have sometimes these ideas built up by our association, our culture. This is what a Christ follower does or says or is or looks like or does whatever. And the fact is, we really don't know what that's to be. It's kind of like we're sitting in this class talking about the church of the future and a church that none of us will ever see because we'll not live long enough to see the next iteration of the church when it finally comes. We're just talking about the fact that that's on its way, and how can we participate in helping that move along. But that's the same in our life. We don't really know what God is doing and preparing us for and shaping us to be in the world. And so to put a stamp on it to say, well, like when this happens, or if this were to happen, then I would be this person that God calls me to be or creates me to be. We don't know that. We don't know what God has in mind for us. We don't know what God has in store or what that looks like. The fact is that Jesus intends for us to live our lives in ways that He would live that life if He were you or me. And so Jesus didn't come as a priest or a high priest or a religious person. He came as a carpenter. He grew up in a working class family, and he had deadly as catch friends. And common people that he hung out with, and most of his ministry is recorded in things that took place in everyday encounters in villages with people during the course of their lives. It wasn't the record that there's no place in Scripture in the Gospels that shows his attendance record at synagogue, or how many verses did he have memorized. and so forth. None of that's there. What's there is how he interacted with people in the course of their daily lives and what that looked like. And the fact is, when he says, he gets into that argument with the Pharisees in John chapter 8, where he's talking about, you're children of your father. If you really loved Abraham, or if you really loved Moses, then you would listen to what I have to say. You would, but his whole thing is you can't recognize what's happening in front of you because you have this preconceived idea of what that's to be, and that kind of confines you to a prototype that's not really valid, or at least not valid anymore. And they didn't recognize him because they weren't part of that sense of living freely in the life of God for the world. They were too busy doing this. And we can fall into this same trap. Do you see how we can fall into this same thing?
I was thinking that's a hard thing not to do.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're just wired that way. We're wired to go that route.
Exactly.
We're not wired for the other.
We're not wired for this. We're not wired for this.
That takes me back to your relative's comment that it's easier to be a Christian in a crowd and harder to be a Christian when you're by yourself.
Yeah.
Because it's, we want to do, at least me, I'm a Martha, I want to do. and God is really telling us to be more of a Mary. And I think that is harder.
Well, I think there's probably a time to be Martha, and there's a time to be Mary as well.
That's your general outlook.
Yeah.
And I also, I kind of grappled with this idea before in terms of good works.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do good works because you're a Christian. Your good works flow from becoming Christian. But I hadn't thought about it as applied to the church as a
Mm-hmm.
whole, the institution. It's like Tracy said, that's what we're decent and do things orderly. We want to have
Yeah.
everything prescribed and to know what the steps are
Yeah.
and how do we do things. And it's when you have an organization, that's just seems natural that that's how we're going to do things. And it's much harder, I think, to have an organization where everybody is more focused on being in God and seeing what God is going to tell us to do.
Yeah.
And what does He have for us to do rather than our own ideas of what we should do for God.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's a great point. And I think this is the very thing that Bonhoeffer was wrestling with as he's kind of going through this idea in his head. Because it is easy to get drawn into an organizational approach to things. And that doesn't mean that an organization can't be fully committed to what we're talking about here. It just has to have as its foundational or as its core value the embodiment of God, as its primary purpose, rather than doing things for God, in the world. It's to release the life of God. So an organization built around the idea of how do we embody God? How do we express God in the world? How can we do that in a way that makes sense in the world just for that sake alone? Leaving the, and here's another piece of this that becomes important, is leaving the outcomes to God. We often want the outcomes to justify what we're doing. And when they don't, then we beat ourselves up or we blame others for whatever. But if we do this just for the sake of this alone, then we leave the outcomes to God, we don't worry about that, then we're released or liberated to simply think and find ways to express God in the world for the sake of God's love for the world. And so we have to find, the redemption of Christianity, releasing it from this into truly this, will happen when we're able to define Christian belief in a worldly way. How do we do that? Right now we do it this way. We have these kind of creeds, we have these ideas, we have this language. I mean, I don't know how popular it is these days, but gosh, a decade ago, even 2 decades ago, or longer than that, when I was training for ministry, so I won't tell you when that was, but it was in a previous century. And so the idea was not to use Christianese. You ever heard that, idea? And it was to find ways to define terms that we all kind of know belong to the Christian vocabulary without using that terminology. So how do you define redemption without using, does anybody even know what redemption means? We all know that that's something we believe in. But if we go out to the congregation and we just say, okay, who would like to take a crack at defining redemption? I doubt we get many takers. Because even though it's a word that we know is important in the Christian vocabulary, we're not really sure how to define what it means, And it's true. That's true for a lot of the concepts and ideas. We just know these are important to us, so we hang on to them and we use them, and we learn to use them correctly. But if we had to really explain them, I'm not sure we'd do a very good job of it. And that's, I think, the core of this, is to get released from the bondage of that language and the confinement of that language into more of a worldly understanding of these terms, or expressing them in a worldly way that is being released from the preconceived notions of that. I mean, we talked last time about identifying as Christian in the world. Well, it's kind of dangerous these days. If you tell somebody you're a Christian, well, what assumptions do they make?
Nationalist.
Christian nationalist.
Depending on their own experience.
Right, I was gonna say, it depends on what they define Christian as.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Christian has an image in their mind that may not match what you mean by that, but
Probably doesn't.
it probably doesn't.
Yeah.
So rather than doing that, so now we're into the Gospel of Mark in the first half of Jesus' dilemma as the Messiah, and academic theological scholarship identifies this as the messianic secret that Jesus knows but is loath to reveal in the first half of Mark. Because you always hear him say what to people? Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. And because of that very idea, because they had in their mind a certain idea of the Messiah, but he knows that he's not going to fit that definition.
Not even close.
They're going to be very disappointed. So rather than have that conversation at this stage of the game, he just keeps it a secret. And so we're kind of in that same situation now. The Christ follower secret is like, we don't really want to say Christian because we don't know what that means in the minds of the people with whom we're speaking. And so we have to find ways of expressing our convictions and our commitments in ways that make sense to them, that allow us to define what that means. And so I think I've suggested the last time we were together is that when somebody asks me, I don't claim to be a Christian. I just claim to be someone who follows the teachings of Jesus. I don't even use Christ follower. I use Christ follower in this setting because I think we all know what that means. But even out in the world now, I will try to use that terminology more like, well, I follow the teachings of Jesus. And that allows me then, if people are interested, to get into what are those teachings. Because usually that's not what happens. Did I mention last week that last time that one of the worst things we ever allowed to have happen is Jesus to become a religious figure? Did I make that statement last week or last time? The worst thing that the church ever did was allow Jesus to become a religious figure, because then he's just dismissed out of hand by people who are what? Not religious. Well, most of the people that Jesus really connected to in his life were not religious, or rejected by the religious groups anyways. And they were stunned that Jesus, hung out with them. But these people were delighted. Jesus was a welcome addition to their party. How many people make sure they invite Christians to their parties so that they can have a good time? No, usually it's the other way around, isn't it? But they welcomed Jesus. So what was it about Jesus that made him so compelling to them that they wanted him there? It had to be the idea that they gained a sense of the fact that God valued them and loved them and cared about them, or at least liked them. And so they welcomed Jesus, whereas the religious establishment didn't. So we have to find in the way that we live for God in the world, or that we live as God in the world, that we find ways that convey the real God, the real image of God, in situations that make sense to the people who have yet to meet God, or to know that this kind of a God actually exists. They have an idea of God, if they actually even believe in God. The interesting thing about atheists is you ask them, well, what kind of God don't you believe in? And they will give you this really awful picture of God. And you can say, oh, well, if that's the image of God, then I am also an atheist. That's not the God I believe in. And usually it's based on experiences, bad experiences they've had, or whatever. Not always. But
there are terrible things happening in the world.
Well, there are.
And that leads to the question, why does God allow this? Which is a hard question.
Well, yes, because Christians have often made statements like, well, everything happens for a purpose. And so then, somebody who wants to be cynical about it says, okay, so what was the purpose then to the Holocaust? Or to my 3-year-old dying of cancer? Or to, whatever.
But that goes to, I'm sorry for interrupting,
Yeah.
I think that goes to living through all of these experiences with God. Instead. I still think both of these call for change in our life. You know what I mean? Each of these understandings, even though you're talking about liberation too, but both, and I apologize, I'm just in my head, have to have a right understanding of costly grace as opposed to cheap grace.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
still in the Bonhoeffer's
Sure.
discipleship.
Sure.
So, but no, thank you.
Yeah. I think, though, that what we're... what time is our church?
It's 9:20.
Oh, it's 9:23.
So we got time.
So we have to be done by what, 9:45? Is that what it is? Okay.
Or 50, yeah.
Or 40. Some people could, or 40.
One thing, I have never been to a large mega church, or these more modern churches, but in your experience or your own studies, have you found that they tend to be more, the word isn't self-centered, but more self-directed? Because the thing that I see as being the in God for the world, I could see that as being interpreted by some people as meaning I'm here to be godlike, or express those teachings to the people in my church and around me. Forget the rest of the world. I'm here just for my local community. Because I ask that because I know that some of those people are very, because I know some of the church, are very skeptical about things like large organizations of religious backing, like the Salvation Army, Catholic Social Service. These are things that are organizations that are set up through churches basically to do good in the world. But these people, are skeptical about that. We should just be concentrating on people. So anyway, when you dealt with these mega churches in the past, do you think that they are kind of like that, or is that just kind of individual?
I can't really say. The churches that I've been associated with, or at least that I've had experience with, have been fairly, people are drawn to them they don't come mega churches don't become mega churches because they do things poorly, or they do things that are offensive, or make people uncomfortable, or that. Usually, the ones that I have known have been very strong and the thing that I always have against the megachurch is the anonymity that it fosters in the people who come. It's like it may be that the staff and the leadership and so forth are very ardent, committed Christ followers who want this and so forth. But the very fact that there's this huge gathering of people can lend itself to the do as much as you want or as little as you want kind of in that approach. So they come and get good teaching or ministry or care, but in terms of translating that into now go and be this way in your community doesn't always happen. They're interested in bringing people to their event, but in terms of being present to people for their events isn't always the same thing. But I don't want to pass judgment on mega churches because they're doing, in many places, marvelous work. But it depends on what kind of church, too. There are some mega churches that I look at and just go, oh my gosh, that would not appeal to me, but it does appeal to some people. So in some senses, I have to come back to, what Paul said. Well, some preach Christ out of envy, some preach Christ out of genuine concern. But in all cases, at least Christ is preached, and in that I rejoice. So to the degree that that's true, I'm happy to support and encourage and delight. I would never tell somebody they shouldn't go to that kind of a church. But I've also known people who said that if they were to plant a church, they would plant it within a block of a megachurch. Because there's always going to be people for whom, A, that isn't appealing, but B, who get disappointed in that experience and are looking for an alternative. And so it just shows, I think at the heart of it, a lot of our expressions of what it means to be the church are culturally developed and they are personal. Yeah, I mean, we come to places that do challenge us to the degree that we allow ourselves to be challenged. But there's a sense of community and warmth and intimacy and acceptance and relationship and stuff that we find here. And I'm not saying that any of that is bad or wrong. I'm saying that we must make sure that our community is following this conviction. That's what I really want to recommend. And so whatever form or shape the future church takes, as long as it hangs on to this value, then it's going to emerge in a way that makes sense to the people who need to know this God at that time. We can't create a setting right now that will meet the need of what's happening in the future. All we can do is say that what we want to recommend to ourselves and to each other is to be this. How is God being seen in your life, in your community? How is God serving in the world through you and with you and by you? And to the degree that a megachurch is able to make those claims, more power to them. God bless them.
I also see these two ideas as you could place them on a continuum in a way. So people grow as Christian. You don't suddenly one day become Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all grow, and we're all in a different place in our growth. And these could be stages that,
Sure, yeah.
Here's the goal.
Yeah.
But that's a stage that you might go through, and you might need that as an individual as well as perhaps as a community.
I think that's exactly right too, because isn't that what Paul is saying in Romans, where he talks about the weaker brother and so forth, and he talks about some of those rules about eating meat and things like that. He says, He says, I won't eat meat if it offends, the weaker brother, even though he knows that that's not truly an issue. But it is for that person. And so while that person is still in that place of maturity, he will abstain so as not to cause that person to stumble in their walk. And so that's, I think, the evidence of that people will grow beyond those things. But that we have to recognize that we sometimes do come through that continuum. Yeah.
And I think that being in God for the world sometimes is maybe misperceived as sort of whatever floats your boat. It's kind of I'm going to go study the Word and whatever it means to me, and I open the Bible randomly, that sort of thing. I think that sometimes there's that perception that people might be creating their own religion or image of God through not being focused on the more structured, orderly, prescribed way of being in religion. And I like the way you've described it. I've tried to describe this to people before, and it's a very difficult thing to explain. That doing good works because that's what you do when you belong to this church is not a bad thing, but then there's more to it than that.
Perhaps I would change what you just said to doing good works as we do because we belong to this church, more to saying because we belong to God. We do this because we belong to God, and this is a concern of God's as well, and this is, God is driving this concern within us. The church is simply the community of people that share that conviction and share that life. And so it's not that the church is prescribing this, it's God activating. That's what happened, Ephesians 2:10, right? That's what you're talking about. And so by grace are you saved through faith, that not of yourselves, a gift of God, so that no one should work, and so forth. And we were created for good works that God what?
May be glorified.
That God what?
May be glorified.
No, that God created beforehand for us. So we're not even coming up with. We don't even have to depend on those things ourselves. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. These things flow from God. And so, and God then gives us not only the ability to do these things, but the opportunity as well to do them. And I think that the danger sometimes that we come up with is that I'd rather err on the side of trusting God, God's life alive in somebody, and letting that. Jesus said, "Wisdom is proved right by her children." Right. So if somebody is living in that life, then we will see the evidence for that, and the outcomes really belong to, God. And so it's not our place to do that as long as we're staying what? It all centers on this, on Christ. It's not just our idea of God. It's Christ's idea of God. So it's falling in love with the God of Jesus Christ. That's the key. It's not falling in love with the idea of God that I have, but falling in love and serving the God of Jesus Christ. And I think this is what the disciples all had a hard time with too, and the people of Jesus' day, because he was describing a God they didn't really know. The God they knew was bound up in this, the distant, angry, God, and this picture of God was so different. And once people got it, they loved it, and they were drawn to it. Who didn't? like it. These people didn't like it because it was too threatening to their position, their power, whatever. So these people loved this picture that Christ gave of God. And I think this is why Paul says later on in Romans, this fascinating phrase that's grabbed me all the time, Romans 8. That could be the Jeopardy thing. I'll put it on the other side of the board and you come up with what phrase it is. It's that little term that Paul uses that says we are more than conquerors. Have you ever thought about that? What does that mean? I've always wondered, what does that really mean? We quote that all the time, or if we know that passage of Scripture, we do. But Paul says we are more than conquerors. And I've been intrigued by that for a long time. It comes out of that passage where he says, what then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who could be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who is the one that condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, was raised to life. So then it goes on to that, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Trouble, hardship, persecution, nakedness, famine, danger, sword. It's written, for your sake we face death all day long. We're considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, then he says, no, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. We are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I'm convinced that neither death nor life, angels, demons, so forth, so on, separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. So he's talking about what it means to be the church, what it means to be the followers of Jesus. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean to be more than a conqueror? I know it, so I've just sprung that on you, and but here's what comes to mind. Conquerors impose their rule upon the vanquished by force. Now remember the times in which Paul lived. So who's the conqueror in that time? Rome is the conqueror. So and Rome, there's the peace of Rome, which is enforced at the point of the sword. And so you can live in peace as long as you abide by our rules, kind of a thing. So conquerors impose their rule upon the vanquished by force. So conquerors may obtain compliance, but not necessarily allegiance. And I think that that's a big difference here. You can gain compliance this way by imposing your will upon other people or what you believe to be, but you don't always gain allegiance that way. But more than conquerors, Jesus came not to conquer, but what? To persuade. To persuade. So Christ is persuasive rather than coercive. And so when you and I live, in God for the world, we live as a persuasive presence, not a coercive presence. And so we're looking for ways to bring out the best in the situation for the world in the power and desire of God. What people don't understand, I think, is that God really desires people's best. God did from the very beginning, always and only desires people's best and best interest, and works then to bring that about. And so, living persuasively means we don't create categories, of in or out, or right or wrong necessarily, friend or foe. We are amid those who may regard themselves as our enemies, but we don't view them that way ourselves. Jesus lived where? Right in the middle of people who wanted to kill him. And he didn't escape and run away from that. He lived right in the middle of that. So, if we do likewise, then we are protected, from the temptation to hate our enemy unto death. It puts us close to our enemies, and we want to be there because that's how Jesus was, and was willing to see them as people who still needed to be released from the bondage that they were in. So I'm thinking that religionless Christianity is a life lived for others without claiming cultural or spiritual privilege. It's just living that life for the sake of embodying God in the world and letting God use that life to bring about God's outcome for the world. And we don't always know what God's outcome in a particular situation is, but we can know how to embody God in a moment. The closer we come to who Jesus is and the way Jesus is in the world and the life, and have an approach to life like Jesus did, the closer we get to this. And we get to the place where we do things that may astound people, and it's because they're not used to seeing that kind of life. They're used to seeing people cling to power, not give it up. They're used to seeing people being vindictive, not blessing. We should have classes in our assembly on how to bless people who curse you. That's what Jesus said, right? Why don't we have classes on how, maybe that's what we have to do next year, is to have classes on the Sermon on the Mount. How do you live that life? That's what captured Bonhoeffer's attention.
Frank, would you agree, I think, that this idea isn't just for the individual, it's for the body of believers as well?
Yeah.
It's not just an individual, meaning I shouldn't be participating in a congregation. This same goal is the goal of what is the congregation expressing? How is the congregation living into God?
Yeah. Because one of the worst things we could get to is so individualizing our life of faith. I think that's what you were talking about, is so individualizing our life of faith that it all becomes about us, personally, individually. And that's the opposite goal of what we want to do. But yes, that's what I'm recommending, is that communities of Christ followers adopt this idea and find ways to encourage this in each other.
Well, I think an expression of that is like to think of the Amish, who are about as devoted to their faith and understanding of God and living it, as you can get in the modern world. And they, to the best of my knowledge, don't do anything outside of their community in terms of, trying to help with the poor, the homeless, and other places. They would probably not understand why we have a mission in a Muslim village in Africa, or why Mother Teresa is helping mostly Muslims or Hindus die in the streets of India.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what I wonder if that's what the future of this kind of anonymous church that we're developing is in this country, where people are more concerned about their individual or American, attitude. That they're becoming more like the Amish in that way. They're just going to become very self-involved, self-interested.
Yeah.
That's what I think is most worrisome with the way the church is growing. They don't see the value of the structure coming together to do good things on a large scale. So anyway.
Yeah. I think that's true. And that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, what time have we got? Oh, we're done. We're done.